Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on our webinar today. Of course, in this ever-changing world, we are still committed to providing you with excellent educational resources. So today we are presenting on supporting the immune system and combating viral infections. This is presented by Dr. Paul Urkel. And my name is Dr. Navneet Nibber, a naturopathic doctor and a medical advisor with AOR. I'm going to be the host and moderator for today's presentation. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items with you. There is going to be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible, time permitting. If you would like to ask a question throughout the presentation, you can do so just by the panel on your side. There should be a little question box, and we'll be moderating the questions through there throughout the presentation. So please note, this presentation is being recorded for future distribution. So the content of this webinar has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It's really meant to be educational in nature, and it should not be taken as medical advice. So we always urge you to consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or a supplement is right for you. Any of the supplements we are mentioning tonight are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of our guests and presenters are our own and may not reflect those of AOR. So let's meet today's presenter, Dr. Paul Urkel, who is a board-certified naturopathic doctor practicing in Toronto, Ontario. Dr. Urkel has a clinical focus on neurological health, chronic pain, and brain injuries, and he's heavily involved in teaching and education. He is frequently writing and lecturing to both the healthcare practitioners and the public audiences. He is the medical director of AOR, and his chief mandate is really in sharing the science and that supports natural medicine and formulating really effective natural health products. So without further ado, we are ready to begin. I will turn it over to Dr. Urkel. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for such a wonderful welcome, Dr. Neerat. This is something obviously that is very relevant right now, and it was not something that originally AOR had scheduled to talk about the immune system, but I felt like it was necessary to really address some of the key questions that our customers, people that are relying on AOR for evidence-based information. So this presentation really is a culmination of the last, I would say, month of research and just really asking my own questions. I'm trying to get my head around this pandemic that we're experiencing. A lot of people were asking me a lot of questions and I didn't have the greatest answers. And so I went looking for them. And so I just wanted everyone to know that that's where I'm coming from. And it's important to understand that, as Dr. Nibber mentioned, nothing that I'm going to be talking about is a treatment for COVID or any sort of virus that we're talking about in this current pandemic. So my goal today is not to give you any sort of treatments. My goal today is to teach you about what we know about key nutrients that you probably all heard of, but now we've taken, a step into the hyper-focus zone to help understand these particular formulations. So just so everybody understands that this is not something that we are going to be treating COVID with. I'm going to be reiterating that a couple times for people that are joining us late. So this is our overview today. I want to start off with just a primer in the Immune System 101. And this is going to get everybody on the same page because I'm going to be using terms that everyone's going to have to understand and is going to really give you a lot more depth about what I mean when I talk about let's support our body's innate immune system. So we'll start with that. I am going to talk a little bit about the COVID virus and the COVID situation, not from a, any sort of treatment perspective, but just some burning questions that you might have. So this might be a bit of a public servant's announcement, and plus on top of that, I'm going to hopefully give you a lot more clarity. I can tell you in the last 2 weeks, the things I'm going to be talking about today, I've had to explain to my family members, to my colleagues, to my patients. So this is something that everybody needs to understand. And it really, as I said, is a culmination of what I've had to do to get my head around this. And I think everybody needs to do that to one degree or another. Then I'm going to talk about some nutrient orthomolecular immune support. So it's almost like 2 webinars in one. The first part is what we talked about just now, and the second part is talking about some botanical and orthomolecular immune supports. Okay, so let's jump right into it because we have a lot to cover and not a lot of time tonight. So the immune system. The goal of our immune system is to protect us from external attacks. And this can be microbes, fungus, parasites, viruses, any sort of foreign invaders. And so that's the main role of the immune system. Now, over the years, especially I would say in the last half century, really with the advent of autoimmune diseases, the immune system really has taken on more meaning and more facets, where it's not just about protecting itself from foreign invaders, but it has to do with a lot more. But today, we're going to be focusing on really the protection of external foreign invaders. And it's important to understand that, and this is simplifying it very much, but it's something that is good enough. What we're going to be talking about today is that our immune system is broken down into 2 arms: the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And I want to share with you a little bit about the difference between the two, because they both play different roles and in any sort of viral infection or any bacterial infection, and they play off each other. So let's start with the innate immune system. So I want you to think about the innate immune system as your first line of defense. This is what is protecting you when you go to the grocery store and touch a doorknob and touch an apple that somebody else touched, and there's a virus on that apple. And you don't get sick every single time you get exposed to a virus. Your immune system, your barriers, for example, something like the cilia inside your lungs, there's these little finger, tiny brush-like extensions that basically move mucus, and the mucus itself traps some sort of bacteria or virus and doesn't allow it to actually be infected. And this mucus is present in the intestinal tract, it's present in our lung system, it's present in our oral and nasal systems. So we have physical barriers as well as chemical barriers. So something like adequate stomach acid is a really important barrier. And so just think about all the things that are constantly vying to disrupt these barriers. So both on a physical side as well as on a chemical side. So many medications, for example, decrease the pH of our stomach. Eating a lot of refined, high sugar foods are going to increase the pH, meaning it increases the pH, which means the acidity actually goes down, becomes more alkaline, and you actually kill less bacteria and viruses. More of them get down into your stomach. So that's an example of the innate immune system. There also are immune cells that are part of the innate immune system that are working as what I call them with my patients. They're the border police. They're the ones that are keeping the riffraff out, and in this case, the riffraff is something like a virus. Then we have the adaptive immune system, and just like the name suggests, this means that the immune system has adapted after they've seen something. So if you just look at the cartoon at the top over here to the right, you'll be able to see that the immune cell has spotted a bacteria or has spotted a virus and says, hey, I remember you. You were something that affected me a couple of weeks ago. I already have the response ready. And so there's a very quick response and the infection doesn't set in. So this is similar to the way that vaccines work, where there's a memory, and there are immune cells that actually are called memory cells, and they remember if you've been exposed to this type of bacteria or virus or any sort of microbe. And this is something that is acquired over time as the immune system gets exposed to some of these pathogens. The main immune cells are called T cells and B cells. So if you see any of those in the presentation, we're talking about the adaptive or the kind of responsive immunity. This response, unfortunately, even though it's stronger than the innate immune system, it's delayed. So the immune system actually has to see whatever it's supposed to be attacking. The innate immune system actually goes and shows it to the adaptive immune system. A lot of this actually occurs in the digestive system. You've probably heard it said that 80% of your immune system is in your gut, and that's because a lot of our development of our response, immune response and immune cells, what is normal, what is your cell, for example, and what is actually an enemy or a foreign object, like a virus or a bacteria, that's developed in the gut. So that's the difference between the innate immune system and the adaptive. And there's this harmonious role that plays between both of these guys. And then since obviously we're talking and focusing a bit more on viral infections, let's talk a little bit just so people understand how a virus actually works. So a virus actually isn't a cell. Like a bacteria is a cell, and a virus actually has RNA or has DNA, but it needs to hijack one of our own cells, or in the case of an infection, many of our own cells. As you can see, this diagram shows the virus, first of all, has to attach itself to a cell. This is extremely important that researchers are now really focusing on with this COVID-19 and the SARS-CoV-2 virus. How do we inhibit the attachment? And the drugs are being worked on for that. And certain, actually even China, some natural health products are being worked on for this. Then there needs to be an entry, and then the cell basically gets hijacked where the virus incorporates its genetic material into the cell's own machinery that it reproduces itself. And it then creates many more viruses that then actually gets exocytosed, or basically kicked out of the cell, and the spreading continues. So this is how one virus can multiply into many viruses very quickly. And so that's basically the graphic representation of viral replication. Okay, so we're going to be referring to that a little bit. So that's just kind of the immune system 101. So let's apply this to COVID-19. And these questions, I have to say, are no way exhaustive. I could easily do a presentation on just breaking down some of the latest research around this whole pandemic. And to be honest, it's a quagmire of information. Every day, people are sending me articles. I'm looking at research, and I have to be honest, things are changing extremely rapidly. They're changing in some cases, and I'll give you an example of that very shortly, but they're changing sometimes day to day. So really the bottom line is we are trying to understand this virus and this pandemic as best as possible. But the fact is we still don't know a lot. But here's what we do know, and this is what I think every one of us should know. It's important to know that this presentation is available to the public. So there's people of all walks of life here. So I think it's important that I've kept it really, really basic. I'm going to try to explain it as informatively, but also as easily to be understood as possible. So the first thing that I want to point out, and this is that example that I just mentioned. Maybe some of you have heard about this. I think Dr. Nibber is going to put out a poll about if people have actually heard of this ibuprofen and the COVID-19 controversy. So let me give you an example of how quickly things are changing. And so you can see here, the poll should pop up for everybody. Okay, so on March 14th, the French health minister put out a tweet that said you should only use Tylenol with COVID-19. Now, I quickly checked in on this, and there was a lot of researchers that immediately responded, and health authorities from around the world that said, hold on here, there's really no evidence for us to even suggest this. But the citation was that there's a hypothetical risk with giving this class of medications like ibuprofen. It may increase the levels of this particular receptor called ACE2. And now, if anybody's heard of ACE2 before, it's actually a target for a lot of blood pressure medications. And I'm glad to hear you can see the results here. Most people have heard of it, which is great. So 84% have heard of this, which is awesome. So just want to explain this, that it was to do with this particular ACE2 receptor, or this enzyme, I should say. And COVID-2, there's research showing that this is the mechanism that it gets inside the cell. So this is why the French minister posted this tweet saying, hey, NSAIDs and other medications may actually increase this. March 18th, so 4 days later, the WHO, World Health Organization, also put out a tweet saying, also be cautious. Now, I also heard there was a couple anecdotal stories from nurses that were circulated online, and frontline healthcare workers saying, you know what, this actually may be the case. So that did kind of put off a couple, red flags for me. And so you can see here, this was literally, I believe it was the same day or just later that day, March 18th, you can see it. Based on the current available information, the WHO came out and said, we do not recommend against the use of ibuprofen. It's a double negative, so it's a bit confusing, but basically is that the WHO does not said ibuprofen's fine. There's no difference between using ibuprofen if you have a fever or Tylenol. So I'm just sharing with you the information. I'm not recommending for you to do one or the other. But the point is that the information changes literally hour by hour. Since this presentation was made, Health Canada also has come out with their own recommendation following suit with the WHO, saying that there is no reason to be avoiding ibuprofen. So right now, I think the recommendation is to follow Health Canada's guidelines and public health. There really is no difference. I think most frontline workers are still sticking to use Tylenol if you can, and then if you have a continued need to keep the fever down, you can use ibuprofen as well. But that's kind of the state of the situation on ibuprofen. One of the questions that a lot of people, and I think this is something the Premier of Ontario and the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, was reiterating in probably the last 2 or 3 days as they're doing their daily updates, is that a lot of people are still not taking this pandemic seriously. And I had to explain this to a couple of my family members and close friends as well, because they were also saying, like, isn't this just the flu? I want to explain to you why it's not. And so this is a bit of a public service announcement in that case. And, I have to answer this question for myself. So hopefully you'll be able to understand it, and then maybe you'll be able to explain it a little bit better to the people in your life that also have these questions. By the way, this picture actually was taken by an Italian photographer. That this was an exhausted Italian nurse. And there's an incredible burnout that's happening right now currently in the Italian healthcare system that we are just understanding the depth of it, and it's continuing to get worse day by day. So everyone's heard of the symptoms of COVID-19: fever, cough, shortness of breath, muscle pains, fatigue, but there also are a bunch of other symptoms like diarrhea, runny nose, and at any of these symptoms, there is spread that can occur. This is very important. And it's not like it's like chicken pox, like you get the particular skin eruptions and it's like a guaranteed. It is quite broad, even though fever and cough are the most common ones and shortness of breath, but there are other things. So that's important to understand. The second most important thing to understand is that unlike the flu, there is a much longer incubation period for COVID-19. What does that mean? That means that you could get exposed to the virus 2 weeks ago and not have symptoms until today. And that does not happen with the flu. The flu happens much shorter time, usually around 1.5 days is the incubation period for influenza. With COVID-19, the average is 5, but anywhere from 1 day to 14 days. This makes it so much more difficult to contain, because if a person gets sick, they're going to they're going to self-isolate themselves if they get sick right away. The problem is that a lot of people are walking around, they have the infection, and they're spreading it to other people, and they're not sick yet, and it pops up later. That's what makes this so troubling. And so just comparing it to the previous 2013 SARS is that the other unique part about COVID-2, which is this current COVID-19 pandemic, is that it's much easier to transmit earlier because it replicates so much faster. So there's this particular point here showing that it is 1,000 times greater. The levels build up so much faster in the nose and the throat, even before symptoms are being found, much quicker than the old 2003 SARS virus. So that's one of the reasons experts think that the spread of this particular virus is so much greater. So it can in summary, it can be spread more easily, it can be spread earlier, and it can be spread longer than both the flu and the previous SARS. This is a great diagram, and if anybody wants to take a look at this article, I pulled it off vox.com because I think they did a great job of putting it in pictorial form. You can see here that basically you're looking at, again, the reproduction time of both flu and the COVID-19. So it's much longer for COVID-19, and you are infecting a lot more people, more than almost double the people with COVID-19 because, again, of that incubation time. There's that 1 to 14 in the second part. And then you can see there's a much bigger hospitalization rate that occurs with COVID-19. So that puts a tremendous burden on the healthcare system. I'm going to show you that in the next couple slides. There's also this thing about mortality rate or case fatality rate, which is the last one. The research is always changing. What we're finding is that the research is showing that there's slight differences between the numbers out of China, out of Korea, out of Italy, out of the US, and anywhere else in the world. So anywhere between 1 and 3.4% is that case fatality rate. What does that mean? That means that if you contract COVID-19, there is a 1 to 3.4% chance that a person will die. Where compare that to the flu, it's at 0.1%. Now, the arguments have always been that, well, we don't know who's carrying this, and the numbers of COVID-19 actually being effective and not getting a very mild form of it are much higher, and that may be the case. And so those numbers, I think, eventually will go down. And I think that the latest numbers are showing around 1%, but that's still much higher than the flu. Okay, so a couple things to understand. Based on the Chinese data, which is where this is what this diagram is showing, is that roughly 14-15% of people that contracted COVID-19 required hospitalization. And out of those, 5% also required intensive care. And now this is what I'm talking about, some of the differences. In other countries like Italy, some estimates are showing that 40% of people that contract COVID need hospitalization. And double the number, 10% need ICU. And so you can quickly see how debilitating this is on the healthcare system, okay? Another big thing that people are saying is that, well, only old people die of it. Well, that's something that's not fully true. You can see the orange graph here. This does show that the deaths go up with age. However, you can see hospitalization is the purple maroon and ICU admissions are the light blue. Those are spread pretty equally over all the ages. So just because you're in your 20s or 30s does not make you immune to COVID. We're not talking about getting COVID. We're talking about being hospitalized, and meaning that I may need a respirator because I'm having trouble breathing. Some of the case reports of people that actually have contracted COVID say that it's extremely, and the ones that go to this point that they need hospitalization, that it's extremely painful and extremely debilitating on the lungs, like having to work for every single breath. So this still can have an impact on all age groups, but it's really the elderly that have the highest mortality rate. So that's something to consider. Also, this is US data. This might be a little bit different for Chinese data. So is it serious? Absolutely, it is. And I think really a lot of it have to do with the fact that it has the potential to overwhelm our healthcare system. Majority of the people are going to get a mild version of it, but the fact that they're easily spreading to people that are vulnerable, there is a much higher hospitalization rate, and for places like Italy that their healthcare system has been overwhelmed, the mortality rate, the case fatality rate has gone up much higher than China, than Japan, than places like Singapore, which lock things down much faster. So some of the things that the government is doing right now is exactly aimed at trying to keep the case fatality rate as low as possible, because the healthcare system is overwhelmed and there's not enough beds and respirators and nurses and doctors to go around. It's as simple as that. Another way to look at this is that we've already talked about the difference between this and the flu, but let's assume that the numbers are similar as the flu in terms of who needs hospitalization. The healthcare system can handle the flu because it's designed every year. There's a certain amount of cases that come in, and that's in the thousands, the tens of thousands actually. And what it can't handle is a doubling of that. It works on maybe a 10-15% margin, but not on a 100% margin, a difference. So that's why this is really, really serious. And then finally, the economic impact of that. We're all feeling that. So hopefully everyone understands why this is as important as it is. I want to make a note about social distancing, because a lot of people are asking, and I think it was pretty clear now we should all do it and we should all follow it. A lot of people still are not getting the message. We have to look at history sometimes to understand this a little bit better. So I look back into some of the data that was from the last 1918 flu pandemic. And you can see here, these are two cities, Philadelphia and St. Louis. And the difference between these two cities, Philadelphia here in the solid black line, what happened with them is that they had the first report that cases were happening on September 17th. And a lot of people, the authorities were like, this is no big deal. And they waited 14 days to implement social isolation, physical distancing. And in this time, you can see there's a huge spike. Again, this was that incubation period that was happening. This was even shorter for this flu. Comparing that to St. Louis, where St. Louis first case happened on the 5th of October, and they locked things down 2 days later on the 7th, and they noticed a much less increase. Philadelphia experienced a 3 to 5 times doubling time for the influenza epidemic. So much, much, much higher. We're talking about, hundreds of thousands of people in this particular case in these two cities. So the social distancing and how quickly that is implemented and how strictly people are adhering to it, we have historical precedent that actually works. So people need to do their part. The government is really trying to offload the pressure on the healthcare system, and a lot of experts are feeling that it might be too late because it's already happening from a community spread perspective. Another question that we had is, why are kids spared? And this is an interesting one. If you look at all the data, and this is whether it's coming from Wuhan, Hubei province, or whether it's coming from Italy or here in Canada, kids are very, very resilient to this. And there's a number of theories, we don't know it for sure, but a couple of them is that our immune systems are better when there are kids, in the childhood period. The innate immune system is slower in elderly, and that's that first response system. It seems like the data showing is that kids are not really even getting very sick at all. So that's something that's really, really important. There's also this potential with this ACE2 enzyme potentially happening in the elderly. So this is something that is one of the key factors that may be related to the spread, and this actually goes down as you get older. So this may actually increase the spread of the virus. And finally, and I find most interesting to me, is that kids have a very, very high level of melatonin. It really starts going down after puberty. And melatonin, as we're going to see, is a very potent immune protective effect, specifically at decreasing inflammation as related to the virus going from something very mild to something very severe. Maybe some of you have heard the controversy about elderberry. I'm not going to spend too much time about this, and I'm not talking about it as a treatment. There is lots of research in this 2019 very recent meta-analysis showing that elderberry was helpful for viral upper respiratory tract infections, especially the flu. Remember, this is not meaning as a preventative. A lot of people are chugging elderberry juice. That's not gonna necessarily do anything. It really has been traditionally always used as soon as a person's getting sick. The controversy really came is that there were some experts saying that this inflammation that causes COVID-19 to go from a very mild infection to a very serious infection in the lungs, it is increased. It's something called the cytokine storm, which is basically these inflammation markers that are going through the roof and causing a lot of this damage. There's some evidence back in 2001 showing that elderberry may increase the cytokine storm. Again, really little evidence. So there is controversy around this. A lot of experts are saying that elderberry is not a cure for COVID, but it also is something that we should be careful of if a person is in those final, those more extreme hospitalization stages. In that case, we basically need to just get them respirated, and we need to take care of them in a hospital setting. Nothing that we have in our toolbox is really going to make a big difference at that point yet. So I just wanted to give people an idea that there is a lot of misinformation out there. We have to take everything with a grain of salt. And I have to say, again, we don't know. The situation with COVID-19 is evolving so quickly that there's not one thing that say, hey, you know what, I have the cure. And we are going to see a lot of that as governments are going to try a lot of medications, and the results may be underwhelming, I think. And that's what a lot of experts are predicting. So basically, the prevention is the best medicine, and that's something you're hearing over and over again. Okay, so let's switch gears. So that was the first half. Now let's talk a little bit about actually supporting the immune system. And I'm going to say it again. These are not COVID-19 treatments. These are not SARS treatments. This is information about how to strengthen your immune system and improve your immune resilience in general, okay? So a couple foundations, and I'm not going to talk about this because we simply just don't have enough time, but just consider a couple things. You know, number one is diet. I'm gonna pick a couple here. You know, diet has a role to play. Sugar, we know that suppresses the immune system. So if you're looking at protecting it, it'll suppress it even very quickly within an hour of taking, you know, 30 grams of sugar, something that you find in, you know, a typical latte. Fruits, vegetables, green teas as a perfect example of flavonoids. These are compounds that have been studied in animal models, sometimes in humans, showing that fruits, vegetables, those colorful pigments are substances that are protective for our immune system. Even though we're physically isolating, we still need to get our physical exercise. I'll be the first one to say that my physical exercise has gone down, and that's to be expected. But there are still things that we can do, whether it's if you're in in your backyard walking, as long as you're keeping your healthy distance, and as long as you haven't been out of the country and you're under a 14-day quarantine, then you should not be going anywhere outside of your house at all. Stress management. Stress through cortisol suppresses the immune system. Anxiety is a huge thing right now, and I'm probably going to be talking a lot more about stress management as time goes on, as we pivot from actually understanding the SARS-CoV-2 virus to actually dealing with the quarantine and dealing with the isolation. So those are a couple things that we can do right at home. Vitamin C. When your body is stressed, your body needs more vitamin C. Your immune system needs vitamin C as part of its immune response. This should say by immune cells in their cellular response. So if an immune system is dealing with an infection, whether it's viral or bacterial, the amount of vitamin C needed goes up exponentially. There's so much information about vitamin C and its antiviral effect, antibacterial effect. It becomes deficient in infections. There is some controversy about whether vitamin C actually can treat the common cold. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the doses that were being used are different than, I think, what a good orthomolecular approach would be. I'm going to share a little bit about that in just a second. There's a lot of different actions here, but ultimately what's unique about vitamin C is that it helps the immune cells do their job better. It improves blood flow, which is always a good thing at transporting immune systems to the area that's needed, as well as transporting waste away. A lot of the junk, like broken up, damaged viral particles, damaged cells, they have to be transported away. So the lymphatic system and the blood system have to do that. One of the reasons why physical exercise is really helpful at getting blood system and the cardiovascular system moving. And it also is a protectant to oxidative stress, especially in more pronounced and severe infections. The amount of oxidative inflammation goes up. So vitamin C not only helps the immune system, but also is a potent antioxidant. And that's something that is often not shared by a lot of other substances. And this is really important, especially in lung injury. Here's the thing about dosing. Vitamin C maximally is about absorbed at 500 milligrams. So that's where the optimal absorption of vitamin C is. That doesn't mean you can't take more of it. That just means that our body was designed to be consuming it all the time from a food perspective. And when we're using a supplemental form of vitamin C, especially if a person's under stress or a person has some sort of infection, the dose frequency does increase. So this is where you talk to your naturopathic doctor about finding that right dose for you, or even your nutritionist or your medical doctor. However, the frequency, I tell you, goes up dramatically, and that, one capsule twice a day or chewing kind of a Flintstone vitamin once a day is nowhere near what's needed. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what the research has been done on, that has basically said, oh, vitamin C is useless in any sort of immune compromise or infection. So we need to increase the dose much, much higher. There are other options like liposomal vitamin IV, but they're a lot harder to get your hands on, and liposomal is more expensive. Vitamin D. Vitamin D is really important for both our innate and adaptive immune systems. There's lots of research. I didn't even cite it here because there's so much evidence. Yeah, it's very easy just to even do a quick Google search to see how important vitamin D is at protecting from infections. And the interesting part about vitamin D, and this has kind of been fleshed out in a lot of research, is that when you're deficient in vitamin D, your need for it goes up, and those are the people that are going to get the most benefit out of taking vitamin D. So the most important thing we can do is go get your vitamin D levels tested. This is going to dictate what you need to do in terms of your supplementation plan, and then your doctor can help guide you with that. But if you're deficient, you're at a much higher risk for all the negative effects, not just bone reduction with vitamin D. Vitamin D is a very important hormone-like vitamin that regulates the immune system and regulates our body's response to an infection like a virus. A couple key considerations, and this is a theme that I've done throughout the presentation, is that we have to look at the fact that vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and if you're not able to absorb your fat, i.e. if you have trouble absorbing fats, you're avoiding fats, you have any sort of gallbladder issues, if you are taking medications that decrease fat absorption, these could be anti-cholesterol medications, this could be acid blocking medications that basically decrease your body's ability to break down fat, you are at a big risk for fat-soluble vitamin deficiency. So this is vitamin D, this is vitamin A, this is vitamin E, vitamin K. These are very important fat-soluble vitamins, but you need your bile from your gallbladder to properly absorb it. So an important thing to remember here is that just because you tested once and your levels were low and you start taking vitamin D, that doesn't mean that you're out of woods. You actually need to retest again to see if your levels actually go up. Because if they don't, and I've seen this many times, then we need to start taking a look at, do you have an issue with absorbing your vitamins? And now you may actually have an underlying GI inflammation issue. There's a lot of cases of celiac. There was a report just recently on Medscape showing that vitamin deficiencies may be the only sign of celiac disease. So we have to be smart about our supplementation, and we can't just say, hey, I'm taking a 1 a day, 1,000 IU, and I'm covered. That is nowhere near what needs to happen, and we need to go about it very rationally. So get tested and then figure out the right dose, and get tested again and see if it goes up. If it is, perfect. You're taking a good form that your body's accepting, it's being absorbed. There's also some genetic factors, and this is something that I know AOR came up with a genetic testing kit that's available to stores and online, and you can see, do you have issues with absorbing vitamin D? And this is another clue that you maybe need to be more diligent with vitamin D supplementation. Okay, so let's pivot from vitamins into amino acids. Hopefully most of you have heard of the molecule called glutathione. And if you haven't, it's the best way to be remembered as the body's master antioxidant. It's really difficult to go over all the different things glutathione does, because it really is, I could do a presentation just on that. The list is really long. It does anything from protecting the liver from damaging chemicals as the liver tries to detoxify. It protects us from things like smoke, air pollution. It protects our nerves, helps repair our nerves, our kidneys, our mitochondria constantly are producing oxidative stress. Any sort of inflammation, any sort of oxidative damage, could be UV rays, could be the food you eat, could be an infection. There's an increased need for glutathione. And NAC stands for N-acetylcysteine, and that is a form of the amino acid L-cysteine that is the key precursor to the production of glutathione. So you can see in this chart here, or sorry, in this graphic showing that NAC is a precursor to glutathione, and ultimately in the bottom red box here, you're going to see the glutathione being properly made right here in the bottom. Okay, so let's understand a little bit of what NAC does, because again, like glutathione, it has a really wide range of effects. And this is really interesting, and I took this specifically from a paper in the Focus on the Respiratory System in the COPD journal. But NAC is a mucolytic. What does that mean? That means that it breaks the sulfur bonds that form thick mucus. So a lot of times when people get upper respiratory tract infections, they get a thick mucus. NAC can help break that up, make it looser and make it more thin, and help move that out of the lungs, because that's one of the big issues with obviously shortness of breath and respirating. It also is a direct antioxidant, so it gets rid of some of that inflammation, and also indirect because it increases glutathione. So ultimately, it's been well studied and well known in the conventional and the lung conventional systems, in the conventional medical systems, because of its wide-ranging effects. And there's research on influenza, there's research in HIV, there's research in chronic lung issues. Probably the way it's used most and probably well known, and it's the common thing in the pharmacopoeia, is to take care of overdoses of Tylenol, because Tylenol depletes glutathione. So it's something that we've known about a very long time as being a very potent liver protectant and an antioxidant. And so it also is a key fuel for our immune cells, especially if a person's really sick, then under immune compromise, it actually will fuel our immune cells and prevent that from starving. Will basically prevent it from actually pulling from our body stores. So I mentioned a couple of these things. It's a potent anti-inflammatory, and it has some direct antiviral effects. And there's a number of viruses that it's been looked at specifically. But I thought I'd include it because it has so much good research on it, and it has this specific affinity with tough mucus and the lungs. There's a lot of other benefits of NAC. It's quite well absorbed. You do have to take it more frequently, and that's kind of a takeaway from the research. Amino acids are typically best always taken on an empty stomach. Vitamin C doesn't matter when you take it. Zinc is ideally on an empty stomach, but it may cause people give them nausea, which we'll talk about in just a second. So NAC is a really broad-ranging amino acid with a lot of great research on it, and it is a precursor to glutathione, which is a really, really potent antioxidant. So I mentioned zinc, really important for the healing of any of your tissues. It also helps regulate inflammation, and it helps the immune system do its job better. So it improves the function of white blood cells, which are immune cells. And it also may play a role in decreasing the entry of viruses into our cells. So this is to do with our innate immune system and kind of our cellular defenses to viruses. So consider zinc, and you think about, where do you usually see zinc? Usually in like a lozenge in most stores. But zinc is something that can be helpful, especially early on in any sort of infection, which is quite in line with what the research is showing. So zinc is a key nutrient when it comes to the immune system. A lot of times there aren't really great dietary forms of zinc. You don't need much, but you may need a little bit more when a person is under stress, and especially digestively, where zinc is very important for maintaining the integrity of the immune system as well as the gut lining. And that's going to help you absorb a lot of your other nutrients and maintain a healthy immune response. Okay, so I have to skip through a couple of these things because we're kind of getting short on time, but I want to make sure that we get and touch on a couple of these key things and get to some of the botanicals. Melatonin, viral infections. I mentioned this already. Melatonin goes down with age. Melatonin's a potent anti-inflammatory. We always think of melatonin for sleep. No, it does way more than just sleep. Helps maintain the integrity of our gut, helps decrease the over-response, the inflammation associated with infections, and protects our lungs. My focus in my practice is chronic pain and brain injuries, and I use melatonin a lot. A lot of my colleagues say, why do you use so much melatonin? Because of this exact reason. Yes, it does help people fall asleep better, but it also has many other beneficial effects. So don't just think of melatonin for sleep, even though it's what everyone knows it for. And so there's research on melatonin specifically with influenza. I want to touch on the endocannabinoid system because this is really unique because everyone's now obviously heard of cannabis since it's become legal as of last year. And it has a key role to play in many receptors in the body. And I want to introduce you to a particular fatty acid that we have in our body called PEA. And so I'm not here to talk about cannabis for the immune system. You know, that is something that it requires a prescription from a therapeutic perspective. And we're going to focus on this substance called PEA because there's actually a lot more research on it than there is on cannabis. PEA is part of the endocannabinoid system. You can see it here, and it actually works on a lot of different receptors as part of the endocannabinoid system. You can see these are the receptors over here. And the best way to understand it is that it enhances your body's own endocannabinoid system, which has a role to play in the immune system, regulating inflammation, regulating allergy, and regulating pain relief. So this is a diagram showing how PEA actually hangs out in your cellular membrane, so it's there. It's also found in diet, and that's how we incorporate it into the cellular membrane. And then as the body needs it, under any infection, under any stress, it's actually carved out of the cellular membrane, and then it's actually produced into these anti-inflammatory compounds, and it supports our body's own endocannabinoid system. The research on it is actually really, really impressive. It's been around for 80 years, and there's over 50 human clinical trials on it for various different things. And usually I talk about it for chronic pain, but I want to just share with you a little bit about it for the immune system. It was actually in the 1970s, the biggest research studies to date really were done in former Czechoslovakia and looking at PEA. The form back then was called Impulsin, and it was studied in Czechoslovakia for the reduction of the flu and colds. And they found that there was a reduction in the symptoms of fever, colds, coughs, fatigue, lost days at work, And majority of those were done in adults, but there also were done in, a lot of them were, one study was done in kids showing that it was beneficial. And remember, the immune system has CB2 receptors on immune cells. So the endocannabinoid system is not just about pain or sleep, which is what everyone thinks about it. It has a wide-ranging effect, and PA is a perfect example of that. And here you can see some of those research studies showing a 45% reduction in symptoms, a protection rate 32, 34, 52, 59. Some really impressive numbers with some really big groups of people, which means that that research is powerful. So this is something that was shown to be taken. You can take it preventatively, as well as you can take it as a potential intervention. If you want to know more about PA, I encourage you to visit aor.ca. There's a lot of great research resources and research studies there on PA, and that'll give you a lot better understanding of this really, really neat molecule that was relatively unknown in North America and especially in Canada in the last, I would say, year or so. And AOR was the first company that came out with it. A lot of other benefits of PA, just don't have the time to get into it. Really, really impressive molecule, and really something we've never talked about for the immune system before. So I'm going to speed through the botanical immune supports section. I think the nutrients that I just talked about, they're considered orthomolecular nutrients. And that means that they're found either in diet or they're produced by the body themselves. And those typically end up being the safest nutrients to use, especially when we're trying to protect from viruses and infections and support the immune system. Because the body is normally getting these through diet, we're just making sure we have the optimal levels. Herbs come in as an additional turbocharger to that. So on top of it, so I think everything that I talked about right now should be in place even before we look at herbs. I have to talk about the whole thing about quercetin, really briefly mention it. So quercetin, probably a month ago, this came out in February. This was an article from Maclean's magazine. So this is nothing that I'm saying, but this is something that came out. This was actually our former Prime Minister's brother, Michel Chrétien. He's a researcher in a Montreal lab. And he, back in the original 2003 SARS outbreak, he was researching an extract that's called quercetin, or an analog of quercetin. And there potentially could be some beneficial effects. So really things started, interest in quercetin really started going up. And so quercetin has been well known in the natural health world as a potent, specific anti-inflammatory. It's found in a lot of fruits and vegetables. It's used a lot for its anti-allergic effects. So it stabilizes mast cell, but there is some research showing that it may have a beneficial effect from an antiviral perspective. Now, it's important to understand this is not a proven treatment. Like I said right from the start, this is not me advocating for quercetin as a treatment. We actually don't know that, but I just wanted to showcase that if you were wondering, if you actually heard about this article, you heard about that quercetin is out of stock everywhere. This is the reason why. And there is one human study that I found that 1,000 milligrams of quercetin resulted in a reduction in sick days, especially in people that were over 40, which was really interesting. So similarly to vitamin D, the caveat is if you're deficient, you get the most benefit. With quercetin, it may be more beneficial for more susceptible people. Just food for thought from the human evidence, human study that we have. Mushrooms. Mushrooms I could probably spend 2 hours talking about, but I want to point out one that has a lot of research behind it. It's been used for many years in Japan. It's called Ahcc, or active hexose correlated compound. And it's actually a fermented mushroom complex that has been used for many years, specifically with different types of viruses, hepatitis, HPV, upper respiratory tract infections. A lot of research actually has been in combination as part of integrative oncology. So if you want more information about Ahcc and all the different research, I encourage you to go to the website here at the bottom called ahccresearch.org. Good website, summarizes a lot of great research, but really Ahcc has really potent effects at activating both the innate and the acquired immunity. Okay, so it has potent effects. And what I like about it is that it is very well researched and it has the human clinical evidence behind it in general for immune support. So that's why I like to use ones that are most support with the most research behind it. I have to say this is a little bit more of an expensive extract because of how unique it is to pull it out from this basically the roots of the mushrooms, the mycelia. The blastomyces is the type of mushroom, and this is a unique way. It's a unique delivery compound. It is more expensive, but it has been used in more severe infections, and that's where a lot of the research. So check some of that research out for Ahcc. You might recognize across the top here lots of different types of mushrooms: reishi, maitake, cordyceps, line mane, shiitake. Some of these you can actually consume as part of your diet. So for example, shiitake mushrooms. I highly encourage everybody to get as much of this stuff through their diet. Definitely, you can incorporate shiitake into your diet, into soups. Really, really important as a way that we kind of can get exposure to what I call with my patients food as medicine. There's lots of research on every single one of these, and I don't have time to go over all of them, but you can see there's a variety of actions. So some of them may be better for supporting your body's ability to deal with stress. For example, here you can see cordyceps has the adaptogen check, where something like holy basil has also an adaptogenic check, but it doesn't have an antimicrobial check. So there are some mushrooms that may have direct antimicrobial effects. So talk to your healthcare practitioner about incorporating mushrooms if you're looking at a particular extract. Licorice root. This is one that's been used in traditional Chinese medicine for a long time, and it has many different beneficial effects. Two of the ones that you should remember. Number one, it helps reduce the effect of stress. So it basically counteracts some of the negative effects of high cortisol. And it can also be helpful if cortisol is really, really low. So it helps extend the life of cortisol. So it's a good balancer. There's also specific research on glycerinic acid, which is one of the active components of licorice root, showing to have direct antiviral effects. So there's actually some research being done in China on viral infections and licorice root. Important thing to note, generally very, very safe. If a person has high blood pressure, they should avoid licorice root because it can increase blood pressure. This glycerin is the substance that has the antiviral effects, but it can also cause this increase in blood pressure. So always be very careful with that. And if you're on any sort of blood pressure medications, also you need to be very cautious with that, and I would recommend to avoid it. Seems to be most effective at preventing the onset and the incorporation of viruses inside the cell. So it has a really good preventative effect. So something that, again, you can get through teas, a lot of teas, and you can definitely get it from supplemental form as well. Astragalus, this one I mentioned specifically because there's actually research studies being done in China on a complex of herbs that contain astragalus as one of them and a couple others. And they're looking at it as a potential SARS-CoV-2 treatment. We don't know what the results are, so we can't advocate for it, but something that's been known in the naturopathic world for a long time. And interestingly, from a traditional Chinese medicine perspective, astragalus has had the affinity for lungs. Any sort of lung issues, astragalus has always been the herb of choice traditionally. Something to consider. A lot of good research on astragalus, just gave you a summary here. Holy basil, maybe some of you have heard it as tulsi. You can find it in teas. Research on it is impressive. Holy basil, most of the research is on blood sugar balancing. So a lot of times people will get kind of the hangry, tired, and hungry, and holy basil helps regulate that, but also has these specific viral research studies as well as immune balancing effects and stress reduction effects. So holy basil is one of my favorite herbs because of the wide variety of beneficial effects, has anti-inflammatory effects too, and is a calming adaptogen. And adaptogens are herbs that help the body deal with stressful events. So holy basil is a really nice evidence-based herb that does multiple things, and especially since we are quarantined right now, I know stress levels and anxiety levels really have gone up, and holy basil can be particularly helpful at doing some of those, helping some of those particular issues. I want to spend last a little bit talking about something called Andrographis. Andrographis is a herb maybe some of you haven't heard about. We've all heard of Echinacea, but Andrographis is probably, I would say, equally or maybe if not more studied than Echinacea. And it's been used in Scandinavian and Asian countries for many, many years at treating common colds and any sort of infections. When you start looking at research, it is really impressive. Again, I'm going to show you some of this. You can see anti-inflammatory effects, immune balancing effects, antioxidant effects, and it decreases the viral incorporation into cells. And this is one of the unique aspects of Andrographis. And so Andrographis is one of these key lesser known herbs that has a tremendous amount of research, 33 randomized controlled trials on reducing duration, severity of cold and flu symptoms, sometimes even really, really quickly. Also, other infections and immune conditions can be helpful with Andrographis. So I find that quite reassuring to know that there's anti-inflammatory effects of Andrographis use as well as the antiviral effects. So a very underused formulation, but really I'd always suggest with Andrographis trying to use it by itself and getting the right dose if a person's feeling under the weather from an upper respiratory tract infection. Traditionally, it's a very cooling herb. For any of you that have experience with traditional Chinese medicine, typically like hot, kind of sore throat, red tongue, red throat, really yellow mucus, those are hot conditions. Andrographis was particularly indicated by the traditional Chinese medicine doctors for those types of conditions. So I want to finish up just by talking about this gut immune connection. So you've heard about the gut and the immune connection. I think I will assume that. Maybe you've heard about the gut-brain connection, but I want to share one just parting thought with you that if the gut-brain has a connection and they're not anywhere related to each other in terms of proximity, then don't you think other organ systems probably have the same types of connections? Yes, they do. And so we just haven't researched it as well. And the gut-brain connection's better well developed in the literature. But I wanted to show you that there is research pointing towards a potential gut-lung immune connection as well. Naturopathic doctors and functional medicine practitioners have known about this for a long time, nutritionists as well, that the immune system doesn't just go to one area. The immune system, which again, as I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, is formed in the gut and outside of the gut, and many probiotics and many microbiome influencers, like, for example, short-chain fatty acids, vitamins, immune signaling molecules are produced by your gut bacteria. They also travel to the lung. So I wanted to show you this diagram because I'm a huge fan of diagrams. That's just me. I'm kind of a more pictorial guy. You can see here on the left side, there is, again, some sort of virus or some sort of antigen that gets into the lung. First, the innate immune system. That's the first line of defense, and they try to clear it out of the way right away. And if that doesn't work, then we have to bring in the big guns, the T cells, the adaptive immune system. It starts going into the lung and potentially could actually have a secondary bacterial infection that starts happening. For this to properly function, you need a healthy gut microbiome. And then you switch over to this other diagram here on the right side, you can see that if the intestines have what's called dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of your microbiome of good and versus bad bacteria, you don't get the proper priming of your immune system. You don't get the proper function of your T cells. And so you have a decrease of T cells going where they need to go. And there's an increase in inflammation. So I'm just throwing this out there right now, and food for thought for everybody is that don't just think about your gut and the health of your gut just for your gut itself. It plays a role in your whole body. So there are things like vitamin D and zinc that I've already mentioned that have a huge role to play on making sure the gut function and gut lining is very, very effective and functioning properly. And then things like probiotics play a big role. Fiber play a big role in regulating gut function, and therefore it could regulate lung function, the susceptibility to bacterial and viral infections. So gut regulates the first response to infections in the lungs, and the gut regulates the secondary response as well. So could this be a potential target? I would say yes. So I'm going to skip this just for the sake of time, because I want to leave some time for questions. I mentioned probiotics, fiber, a number of other things that could be very helpful for the gut system. We don't know that. There hasn't been good connections, but there is research on the probiotics helping the immune system. That is definitely something that is evidence-based, and I didn't have time to go over that, but that is something that I'd suggest that you look more into if you're interested in it. So in summary, we talked about vitamin C, zinc, NAC. We talked about vitamin D as prevention, especially if you're deficient. We talked about 4 of my favorite herbs in terms of immune support. And then my final, takeaway clinical pearl is when it comes to viral and bacterial and any sort of immune challenges, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. And that means that if we're being proactive on making sure all these nutrients, especially the ones I talked about early, are high levels before we get infected and in the early stages of infection, before the cells have been taken over by the virus and the viral titers go up or the viral levels go up, we can be much, much more effective in preventing the onset of some of these infections. If you do get infected by any sort of virus, I'm not talking about COVID. You know what to do if you have a COVID infection or suspected COVID infection. The government and the public health authorities have been very clear on that. I'm talking about another viral infection, another bacterial infection, or something in the future. You definitely want to be proactive, and you can do some of these things early on to offset some of the things before some of the binding that happens into the cells. So at this point, I know we raced through a lot of that stuff, and I probably could spend double or triple the amount of time. At this point, I want to just share, just open up the questions for a little bit of Q&A, and I'm going to hopefully spend a little bit of time answering some of those questions. So I'm going to let Nirat, who's been kind of moderating this for us, I'm going to let Dr. Nibber kind of take over and facilitate that.
Hi there, Paul. Yeah, thank you. That was incredibly rich. Lots of questions have arisen. So we have a couple individuals who are concerned about medications that they seem to be taking, things like methotrexate or prednisone, which traditionally they hear dampen the immune system. So the question is, by how much is it? And if you could speak a little bit to how medications are influencing.
That's a great question. And one that I know a lot of people online and social media are asking. You mentioned a class of medications like methotrexate, and there's another one like Humira. These are immune suppressive medications, typically given to people that have autoimmune conditions. And they do have the warning that they suppress the immune system. This is a well-known side effect. The susceptibility for infections do go up. By how much? I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows that, especially when it comes to this particular pandemic that we're in. So it's tough for me to share that or give any sort of insight, but just know that they do. And I think that those people, need to be more proactive with their physical distancing and their hygiene. And I think some of the things that we talked about from a preventative perspective could easily be good candidates for you to talk to your healthcare provider. A lot of naturopathic doctors like myself, we are doing virtual consults still. And so if you're working with an ND or you're working with a healthcare professional that's been guiding you with nutrition and you have questions about medications, this is not the forum for me to say, yes, that's good or not, or which particular thing, because that is something that needs to be personalized for it to be effective and safe. But I encourage you to get in touch with somebody that has been, either you have been working with or somebody that has this expertise and maybe offering virtual consults. So this is something that hopefully is going to be mitigated by some of the basic distancing principles and hygiene, but it is a consideration and it's something that we should be aware of.
Excellent, thank you. There was also a question in regards to the classification. So SARS and MERS, as we know, are considered syndromes. In your research, was there any explanation as to why COVID-19 right now is being more considered a disease rather than a syndrome with a spectrum of symptoms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's more of an epidemiological type of question that will be, figured out as this pandemic kind of, I think progresses and we get a little bit more of a 2020 perspective on it from hindsight. My understanding is that this virus is called SARS-CoV-2. So it's the coronavirus that causes the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which is what SARS stands for. And syndrome, as you mentioned in the question, is we still don't know exactly what's happening or what's causing that. So I'm not sure exactly why they've switched the convention to the disease. My assumption is that it has to do with the fact that there is a very specific disease state that's associated with the respiratory symptoms and the ultimate need for hospitalization and ventilation. So I think that's why it's happening, but I'm not sure exactly why they chose to give this one a disease state versus the MERS and the SARS, where they kept those at syndromes.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of people obviously are getting lots of pieces of information, so it's nice that you keep emphasizing this is evolving, it is constantly changing. So we have another question here. I know we're running out of time, so I want to make sure everybody's questions get in here. So in regards to mushroom supplements,
Yeah.
should they be stopped when ill because they are quite immune stimulating? And on that note, what are your thoughts on shaga?
Yeah, great question. And so that's one of the reasons that we're not talking about this in terms of COVID. First of all, this is not the form. We're dealing with lots of different people with different walks of life, different medications, different health issues. But it's still something that needs to be considered when some of these herbs, especially, could be increasing some of the inflammation that is happening as a person goes into kind of those hospitalized states. So we don't know, and that's why those treatments are not being used. I can tell you that there is research being done, and you can look at this. The International Society of Orthomolecular Research.org, ISOM.org. They have done a pretty good job of summarizing some of the research that is being done on things that are outside of the pharmaceutical world. So if you want to look at for example, some of the research on vitamin C, and as I mentioned, something like vitamin C is going to be helpful at addressing the tremendous amount of inflammation as well as supporting the immune system compared to a herb where it may be better in the earlier stages. So we don't really know that yet. And that's why none of this is being recommended at all for treatment of COVID, and nor am I recommending this for anybody. So I think that that's something that hopefully will come up more as the research comes out, but it's good to know that it is actually coming out and is being done.
Okay, so we have time for a few more. So Andrographis, when you're discussing that, someone would like to know, is that generally used more preventatively or just at the onset, as it's quite cooling? Yeah, so if it's without a heat type condition, is that going to be an issue?
No, not at all. That's just more, I always mention that because that's just a good way to remember it. I know that's the way that I was taught in naturopathic medical school. So I always remember it that way, but the research didn't look at it in that way. Those 33 randomized controlled trials didn't look at it, was the person having hot conditions or not? So I think that it can be definitely used in any sort of upper respiratory tract infection. A lot of the research looked at sinuses and nose and throat. Those are the kind of main areas.
Okay, great. This is a great question in regards to things that we should kind of consider stopping at the first sign of infection or fever in particular from natural products. Is there anything we should really just avoid and stop right away?
Sorry, can you repeat that question, Dr. Nimish?
Oh, is there anything that we should consider avoiding at the first sign of infection from natural products?
Yeah, again, I think that there is a list that is circulating around in the naturopathic world, looking at potentially, some of the things like elderberry. I think it's not so much a first sign of infection, Dr. Nimber. I think it has more to do with if it goes into that, cytokine storm, that we need to be a little bit more concerned about that. I think at first sign of infection, that's where you can be more aggressive typically with the guidance of your naturopathic doctor or your functional medicine practitioner. So I don't really have anything off the top of my head that at the initial signs, and that's definitely when like something like vitamin C, the research shows you'd want to amp it up.
Okay. So we have another question in regards to the role of allergy in viral infections. The allergy, is that, specifically increasing that cytokine storm? Is that something we
Yeah,
need?
well, I think it's quite different. This type of cytokine storm is much more severe than any sort of allergy, and I think that maybe in anaphylaxis you might get some of this, but even then it's a little bit different. It's working on mast cells, and you're going to get a lot of histamine, where you're not getting as much histamine with this type of reaction. You're really just getting a tremendous amount of inflammation that's happening at the level of the alveoli, which is the lung tissue, where the oxygen exchange occurs, and then you get fluid buildup that starts occurring, and then you actually can get possibly issues with blood coagulation. And so that's where a lot of the need for the respiration happens, is that the lungs get so filled up that you actually can't get any sort of oxygen exchange. There may actually be kind of a subsequent bacterial infection that comes over top of that, and that's typical for pneumonia. So it's a little bit different than allergy, and this is something that's really unique, which is one of the reasons I think it was called COVID-19, because it has this really unique expression of severe lung issues, and I think this is common in the SARS family.
Okay, great. And then finally, we have a question. I think this will be the last one we can take. So, would you still recommend taking specific immune stimulators in individuals to prevent viral infections such as COVID when you already have a pre-existing autoimmune condition?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I know someone reached out to me on social media to make sure that we answered this, and I did promise them that I would answer it. So here goes. With autoimmunity, we always have to be more careful. The immune system, every autoimmune condition has a little bit of a different profile when it comes to immune balancing. So this isn't across the board, but in general, we typically make the mistake of assuming that if I'm taking a quote unquote immune booster or immune stimulating herb, it's going to have a negative effect. And so I'm going to give you the example of Andrographis first. Andrographis has antiviral effects, it has antibacterial effects, it also has anti-inflammatory effects. So it has been specifically studied with multiple sclerosis and ulcerative colitis. These are autoimmune conditions to have a beneficial effect. So this is something that I didn't have time to cover today, but there's research on those conditions. And that shows you that some herbs can have both of the effects, and that just because it's an immune quote unquote stimulator doesn't mean that it may have a detrimental effect on autoimmunity. The fundamental question is that has it been studied in autoimmune conditions? And there are a number of herbs that have been. So I would first of all look for those. Second of all, the nutrients I started talking about today, the orthomolecular nutrients, as well as what I ended off talking about in terms of gut health. So I skipped over things like probiotics, vitamin A, colostrum, lactoferrin. These are substances that help regulate the immune system that are normally found in foods like colostrums found in breast milk for newborns, lactoferrin you can find in whey protein, probiotics, you know where you get those from, et cetera, et cetera. Things like vitamin C, vitamin D, PEA, these are very, very safe substances that the research shows are beneficial in autoimmune conditions because the body normally makes them or uses them or gets them through diet. So I typically always tell my patients that the substances that have the research on it, and the second thing is we can really look at the safety profile in terms of, is this something naturally found in your diet or is it an orthomolecular molecule? And that is a kind of a simple way of saying the body knows how to deal with it. It has certain either pathways or production mechanisms, and it's much more difficult to have a negative effect. We never have an Andrographis deficiency or a curcumin deficiency, but we could have a vitamin C deficiency locally, and we could have a vitamin D deficiency. So I would stick to the orthomolecular nutrients first, get those optimized, focus on our gut function, and those will directly and indirectly support your immune system without having any sort of safety issues. And then if you want to look at herbs, then you have to look at specific studies. But all of this is done in the context of a healthcare practitioner that will guide you through a personalized plan, because you can't just try to do different things on your own. There are nuances, and we don't want there to be any interactions or negative effects.
Yeah, that's great. And I think actually that addresses, someone just had a question in regards to how much is too much vitamin C in someone for an autoimmune. And would you probably say it's the same idea? You really want to be.
I mean, in this, I see that question, and my answer to that is there isn't really too much vitamin C, because your body will just need it and use it and absorb it as needed. And that's the beauty about a lot of these autoimmune substances, especially vitamin C and magnesium, which we didn't have a chance to talk about today, because they have mechanisms built in place. So specifically those two, and especially vitamin C, your body just has bowel tolerance, and so I have not seen any negative effects of oral high dosing. You can't overdose on it.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so very much. I think we have covered so much ground, and I know it was just a wealth of information. So I just really would appreciate this, and I know everyone else does. So if anyone does have any additional questions, you can email our marketing team at marketing@aor.ca. And our marketing team also did want us to mention that there is a promotion for a free hand sanitizer. So if you're purchasing any immune supplement products on our website, you can also get some free hand sanitizer. Also note that that is not hospital grade hand sanitizer. These are the small kind of ones that go in your purse. So our next webinar is actually coming up on April 28th. I know some people were asking, they want more of this great information. It will be at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It'll be Chantal Dumas, who will be presenting on how to optimize your digestive health and building a healthy gut. So if you're not registered, you can absolutely go ahead on over to our website, aor.ca/webinars, and sign up there. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful evening and you're staying safe and socially isolating as needed. Thank you and take care.